Hello and welcome to the Cult Vault podcast, your dedicated podcast for uncovering the darkest corners of cults and coercive control. I'm your host, Kacey, and I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for tuning in. Your support fuels our deep dives into these critical issues. Before we get started, a word of caution. Today's episode may contain discussions on abuse, including graphic descriptions of abuse, and covers a variety of human rights violations that may be triggering for some listeners. Please consider this as a trigger warning and proceed with caution. I'm thrilled to announce that I'll be appearing at CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June 2025, and again in Manchester on the 27th of September 2025. Join me and a host of world-leading experts, advocates and noisemakers at the heart of the true crime community. This is the UK's biggest true crime event, and you won't want to miss it. Use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, for 10% off your tickets. And remember, there are flexible tickets and payment plans available to accommodate everyone. This incredible event is sponsored by True Crime, and it's always my favourite weekend of the year. I hope to see some of you there. And for those who want even more from the Cult Vault podcast, you can access early, ad-free content by supporting me at patreon.com/thecultvault, where every pledge not only gives you exclusive access, but also directly supports the continuation of this work. Thank you again for your support and your listenership. Now, let's unlock the vault. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and today I am joined by a very special guest who has sent me a copy of her recently published memoir to read through and discuss today. Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Sarito.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
I usually start by asking every guest to introduce themselves to the listeners.
Yeah, so my name is Sarito Carroll. I was a child in the Osho Rajneesh cult. I joined when I was 9 years old, and I was there until I was 16 when it all fell apart as part of the Rajneeshpuram city in Central Oregon. So I was in the movement from its time in India through its demise in Central Oregon.
The book that you've just published, In the Shadow of Enlightenment, A Girl's Journey Through the Osho Rajneesh Cult. How did you decide what name to use for the Rajneesh movement? Because there's several different names that group goes by.
Yeah, it was actually a challenge because, when I first joined the movement, the name of the guru was Bantri Rajines. And then that was his name through the whole time I knew him or I was involved in the movement. And then after that, it changed to Osho. So I guess I just sort of took a liberty and joined his surname with his new one and only name. And so I created Osho Rajneesh, which I just wanted to be able to capture everyone's attention who knew him as either name. And so that's sort of why I went that route. Because if I just said Osho, I think it would have not captured some of the people who knew of Rajneeshpuram, for example.
Right, because that's another, and sannyasins is another word that some people would identify with, which of course you use throughout the book, but it's hard, I guess, when you're an author to make the decision on, what do you include in the title of the book?
Yeah, it was actually a long process to come up with the title, even though it's not very long, but just to try and really, in a very few words, get the essence of what the book is about.
What inspired you to finally tell your story about your experiences in the Rajneesh movement? Was there a specific event that happened, or was it a combination of things over time?
It was a combination over time, but then certain more current events sort of were the catalyst. So, I mean, all through my 20s, I was wrestling with my past in the Commune, and I wanted to write, and I just sort of kept losing my momentum, or I had too much self-doubt, or, I was also very scared to come up against a big organization that had pretty much normalized my experiences, which is a lot of sexual impropriety. And then around 2000, things came up in my current life where people were bringing up the abuse in a sort of subtle way. And at that point, my internal turmoil about it got stirred. And at that point, I wrote a letter to my main perpetrator from the Commune. And when he didn't respond for 2 years, it just left me seething and feeling sort of oscillating between feeling disempowered and feeling enraged to the point that I was going to take this on. It was my only, I felt like at this late stage, 40 years after these events happened, the main source of advocacy that I had was my voice. And then, so I wrote the letter, and then when that never went anywhere, and these discussions continued in some private Facebook groups, Rajneesh Facebook groups, the topic of abuse of the children came up. And at that point, I thought, okay, I'm coming out, fully. And at that point, that got a response from the main perpetrator. So it took a whole community sort of cornering him for him to actually respond. So that, coupled with Wild Wild Country coming out, the docuseries on Netflix, which showed a lot of the history of Rajneesh porn, but it did not show the children, did not discuss the story of the children and the neglect of the children and the abuse of the children. So I'd say all those factors together finally got me to sit down and be disciplined and author the book.
There's so much in your memoir that I found it quite a challenge to put our questions together today. It's one of the longer memoirs I've read, and it's so detailed and it spans over quite a significant amount of time. And I kept thinking back to my first interview about the Rajneesh cult with author Ronit Plank, who wrote about her mother leaving to join the Rajneesh movement. And I remember her saying when she watched Wild Wild Country, just to see if she could spot her mum, just out of curiosity, like what was she doing during those years when she left me behind? And then it occurred to her that there are no children in that documentary. And I hadn't even thought about that until she brought it up. So what can you tell us about, at that time, there were clearly children involved, even if they're not in that documentary, because you were one of them.
Absolutely. So that documentary it was all very accurate, but it took existing footage that was archived, in various TV stations or, the Oregon Historical Society, various outlets that had recorded and come to the ranch and done some research or filming. But it didn't go into investigating actually the daily life or the children. And I feel like we weren't in the footage because we were sort of firstly, we were blended into the culture, the older ones, over 12, we were working. And the younger ones were sort of isolated off in the city of Antelope where they went to school. So we weren't we were sort of like the lost tribe. And what happened to us was so normalized or kept out of the public purview that we didn't appear. And I think that that's one of the key points, was that when I saw the documentary and I didn't see any of the children, it was like, if you didn't know better, you wouldn't look for us. And so I part of me speaking up is saying, hey, we existed, and stop ignoring our existence and our stories. And it made it very clear in Wild Wild Country too, how invisible we really were.
Yeah, absolutely. As you just said, it didn't even occur to me until Ronit said something. And I thought, oh my gosh, absolutely. There are no children that I can recall seeing, just in the background footage, playing or even working, as you said that you were over the age of 12. So it's been very insightful and an education to read your memoir and learn about what was happening to you and your peers, because it's you talk about children of a similar age and children younger and older that were around you as well during your years in this group. I wondered if you could give us some context about the period of history that you were living in and how that might have influenced the upbringing that you had before your mum entered into this cult?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was the it was the mid to late 70s. But before that, that's when I joined the Commune in the late 70s. But before that, it was the whole sexual revolution, all these protests for freedom, all these young people revolting against the 50s and the repressive regimes. And so it was the birth of the hippie movement that came out of the beatnik movement, and people were turning to Eastern philosophy for guidance. People wanted a new way of life, a way that didn't feel so restrained. And so that was mushrooming up everywhere. And my mom was right in the middle of that movement. And so we were already sort of these wandering hippies, and my mom was searching for meaning. And like many of her peers in that sort of subculture, a lot of them turned to Eastern philosophy and to following different gurus. But I'd say that Rajneesh was probably one of the predominant gurus because he really appealed to the Western mindset. He offered what they wanted. He offered freedom. He offered enlightenment. He offered, community, which a lot of these people were seeking, this sense of community that wasn't mainstream society.
What's some of the other communities that your mum accessed before really finding a place in the Rajneesh cult that she wanted to stay in?
It was more like sort of this alternative culture of these hippies who wandered around and gathered. And so we did live in a kind of community setting in southern Colorado. So it's very much living off the land, living off grid, being self-sufficient, taking care of each other's children. And that was, in that little community I was in, it was probably only 15 people. But I could tell that she already had that sort of longing to be in a community. And I think it wasn't until we got to India that that community really existed. Before that, it was just sort of these little potential communities that didn't offer everything she was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even in India,
sort of.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry,
you go. Sorry, you go.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I hope you can cut that out. Even in Hawaii, we were living off the land, and there were many other people living off the land. So that, in a sense, was this other subculture, but it wasn't a proper community that was self-contained. And so that's very different than a cult that is much more self-contained. I mean, of course, you could be in a cult and not be in the community, but often they have this closed-off system. And that's what it was like in India and in Oregon.
Yeah, I was really interested in reading about the sort of nomadic lifestyle of the hippie movement and moving around place to place. That, I imagine, is adventurous for some adults, but I found it difficult to read about your experiences as a child going through that nomadic lifestyle. And I wondered if you could just speak to the impacts that had on you as a child, never really settling in one place.
Yeah, so I always wanted just a home, and I always wanted to fit in and go to school like other kids and be normal. So for me, this constant moving left me feeling very uprooted and very lonely, because it was very hard to bond with people if you're going to be leaving again in 6 months or maybe a year in some cases, but not longer. And I think for me, it left my nervous system like highly hyper vigilant and activated. And I think I also learned to shut myself down a lot of emotionally, because I after being hurt several times by the separation, I think I learned very young to be as self-sufficient as I possibly could be. And so I didn't feel like I actually had a true childhood. And there's a lot of longing to just belong to the culture. And so I do think then when I ended up in India, even though it was a different kind of culture, I was so much seeking to belong that I just dove right in.
There's the word detachment that you used. I think that's such a great way to describe the relationship that you had with your mum growing up, because sometimes she was with you, other times she was away and you were with strangers or sometimes family members. And then she would almost be upset that you didn't have an attachment with her. But
Exactly.
of course, you never really had a chance to form those attachments.
That's the thing. So already had the situation with my dad was basically non-existent, and the little contact we had was not good at all. And then having her be so loose and following these precepts about freedom, but as a child, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like abandonment. And so, yes, in order to protect myself, I mean, it's taken me years to unpack this. In order to protect myself, I had to withdraw, because imagine trying to be attached constantly to this figure that's not giving you the mirroring you need from a psychological point of view. And then turning it around to say, well, you are rejecting me. And then you're this child trying to figure it out because you don't have this abstract thinking abilities at that age. And so you're almost, your system has an automatic reaction to kind of shut down and become kind of separate in your own little bubble of protection, the best that you can do, whether it's like a physical mechanism, but it's a shutdown in some sense, a shutdown of your full openness to the world because it's not safe.
There was a moment in your writing where you described going to a grandparents' house for the first time. And I don't want to give too much of the book away, but this particular experience, I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through what that was like for you, going to this house and seeing these things that you'd never seen for the first time. And what age were you when this happened?
I was around 6 years old when I showed up at my grandparents' doorstep, maybe I met them when I was a baby, but I didn't have any memory of them. And I had this whole preconceived notion that grandparents were, the stability and the loving home. They offered the loving home that I didn't have with my mom, like just a very stable life. But I got there and they were so appalled at how I looked and, just who I was. And it wasn't really a welcoming reception. But then when I was in their house, it was like this mixed thing, like it felt sort of dank and stagnant. And I think it's partially who they were. But I was, in one sense, drawn into like TV and plumbing and things I wasn't familiar with. But at the same time, there was still not the doting, loving grandparents that I hoped for. So, and I think the main thing I remember experiencing is just wanting to be invisible and shame for how, how I didn't fit in and how they, again, it felt like they didn't welcome me with open arms. So I just felt this like kind of heartache and let me just be as small and the least amount of trouble I could be while still existing in a human body.
Such a sad thing to think about, a 6-year-old child who, 6-year-olds are typically loud, adventurous, like finding their way in the world and, where they like being as big as they can be. So the thought of you trying to make yourself small it's a difficult image.
It is. I mean, I think from a very young age, I feel like I internalized some thought process of my own because of the circumstances around me that I was a burden. And so wherever I went, I felt like I was a burden. And when I was in a more comfortable environment, which was usually rather temporary, I would open up and I would be that child and I'd find that joy and the connection. But then I would move again. And so, when this happens over and over again, you get more tenuous about taking that risk.
Yeah. The way you described seeing running water for the first time as a 6-year-old child was just wild to me. As somebody living in, like a first world leading country, that's not something you ever expect to read a 6-year-old experiencing for the first time. And it wasn't long after that your mum sent for you to move again, but this time it was to Hawaii. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. So around 6 or just around 7, maybe when I just turned 7, I think, is when I met up with my mother in Hawaii.
When did she first find out about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and how did she fall into like really applying the teachings to her life and taking on board like this guru as her leader?
Yeah, I mean, it must have been some time around when I was 8.5 or 9, and one of her friends had come back from India, and I mean, I think it was actually a man who was trying to date her, and gave her the books and was telling her how great it was. That's my recollection. And then she read the books, and I think she was curious. I don't know how much she, was doing the meditations or anything at that point, but soon after that, she started wearing orange, and I was just like, oh gosh, we were already on the fringe, so I already felt uncomfortable not being sort of in the mainstream, and so she's showing up in orange, and the next thing you know, she got the mala in the mail. And so at that point, I think she was intending to delve deeper, but I don't know to what extent. But her curiosity was enough that she decided that we should go to India during my summer vacation from school. And it was meant to be just a short visit. But once we arrived in the ashram, that was it. We were there. We were in the movement for 7 years.
Was that experience like going over to India?
It was overwhelming. It was so, so much stimuli after living in Hawaii in the jungle. We lived off the grid, in a little grass shack, essentially. And to go then to this bustling, dirty country, all the smells, all the sights, all the people pulling at your clothes, riding in the train with people like staring at you, like wanting money, because I was, white, seemingly privileged, even though I wasn't, so that was overwhelming. But then getting to the ashram, it was like this peaceful oasis with all these open-hearted people. And that was very soothing and I guess seductive for me, this girl who's been sort of this lone wanderer in a sense, being welcomed by a whole community essentially. So I wanted to be there. I mean, I didn't, also you're a kid, you don't really think about the future, you're not planning. So I was just like, this is great. Yeah.
The description around the difference between inside and outside the ashram the contrast was really interesting to read about. And I wondered if you could just describe what that was like.
Yeah. So just out front of the ashram, you come from the sort of bustling streets of Pune where the ashram was, or is, I guess, again. And as you get closer to the ashram, it goes into the swanky neighborhood, these big mansions behind these wrought iron gates. And you still have the hustle and bustle of rickshaws coming back and forth and some, beggars on the streets because they knew the sannyasins were there that had more money than them. So just outside the gates, there was still some of that, not to the intensity. But then you walk in, it's like these lush gardens, flowers, peaceful music coming from the meditation hall, all these Westerners dressed in Indian clothes, kind of ambling along with smiles on their face and this sort of their eyes are sort of dilated with joy. And you're just like, wow. So that was my first impression. And everyone was so kind, like, oh, welcome. And, yeah.
Everyone's dressed in orange.
Everyone's dressed in orange. Everyone's wearing the mala with the Rajneesh's picture in the locket. And there's this sort of communal sense of bliss and connection. Yeah. So coming from that, it's like literally walking through a gate into another world.
Did the atmosphere always feel like that? Or once you had seen sort of the day-to-day operations of the group, did that ever fade away?
I'd say it wasn't wasn't the main theme quite as much. It was still there to a point. There was generally a sense of goodwill and care, but then sort of in the shadows, there was some, there was a lot more things I saw once I got deeper in, which was like the very open sexuality. So I witnessed a lot of sexuality. I could hear people screaming in the therapy group sometimes. I would see people with maybe a broken arm or a black eye now and then. You know, and then of course when I worked in the office, I heard a lot of stark or kind of intense calling out or people being told off. So that's when I sort of saw more of the power structure that was going on, or the hierarchies that were in place. There were several hierarchies in place. So it wasn't as kind of all light and love as when I first got there, but there was still a general sense of people were there for good reasons. They were really trying to work on themselves. And as a child, I didn't go deep into the therapy groups. I didn't do the therapy groups. And I think that's one area where a lot of adults, young adults mostly, that were coming, did the groups. And some of them found that quite traumatic in retrospect, because it was about stripping away your ego, your Western ego, to find your true essence. But in that sense, it was sort of like stripping away your personality. And how I see it now is that was a way to promote devotion. See, so that's sort of almost a rite of passage towards indoctrination.
And from what I understand, most people don't live in the ashram, they live in the surrounding areas. So where would you be sleeping when you weren't at the ashram?
So basically some people live in the ashram, sort of more important people and people who'd been sannyasins longer. And when I first got there, I lived in a flat with my mom. We just found a room that was available with some other sannyasins. And there were people all sort of surrounding. It's true. So when you're out on the streets, you would often see sannyasins walking. As you got closer, there's more sannyasins close by. And even if I was down in the city center, I'd see sannyasins. But I was very quickly taken under the wing of the sort of administrative inner circle. Especially one woman became kind of like another surrogate mom. I had several throughout my life. And so I actually lived inside the ashram. And I shared a room with two other children. And soon after that, my mom moved in too, but not living with me, just living somewhere completely separately with other adults. So, yeah.
Even though you and your mum traveled over to India together and you were kind of going through this experience of going into the ashram for the first time, seeing Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh in person for the first time, you were doing all of these things separately because you were still detached as a mother and daughter.
Well, that's one aspect. So in a way, it was a perfect storm. So I already had this situation with my mom where I had, once the attachment kind of got severed, instead of chasing her, it was a mixed bag. I was chasing her, that attachment, trying to bond, but also feeling so hurt that I would reject her or just, but at the same time, the commune, what Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh would say about children is the first thing was that this is no place for children. Children are a hindrance to the spiritual path, but also the second thing he said was that children belong to the commune. And so that parents didn't have to be their only parents. Everybody would be their aunties and uncles. And so in this situation, it just dovetailed perfectly into my situation. And so that was what the culture was. And I wasn't the only kid sort of left to my own devices. We sort of bonded together. But that was not just for me. It was a lot of parents were doing groups or working while the kids were off doing our own thing.
Gosh. And I imagine that if your mum was feeling any type of guilt or being torn between like staying with you and finding a place to settle or being part of this free-flowing kind of hippie movement, then she had just found the answer in kind of justifying what she'd been doing with you your whole life. In this particular place, she'd found somebody give her permission to have the relationship and setup that you had.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was a conscious thing, because her thing, I really think that her true belief was that she needed to give me freedom because she grew up in a very strict household. And so she really believed giving me freedom was what I needed. And by that point, when I was throwing all these tantrums because I was so hurt, I think she thought this was going to help me. And but it also let her off the hook. So yeah, it was sort of a perfect storm that way.
When you arrive as a child, what does the day-to-day, you said that you don't take part in the meditation classes and things like that. How does the day-to-day differ for you than from the adults that would go to the ashram daily?
So for me, I would go to the discourses in the morning for the most part until later I sort of slept off. But I'd go to the discourse. So that was like an hour and a half every morning. Then I would go eat breakfast, skip around the ashram, maybe sit on the Zen wall. This is before I got pulled into the office. I'd sit around watching people pass by, wander with other kids that I met. Meanwhile, my mom is doing groups and other people are working. So there was a school. I went there a couple times. Some of the kids went there, but there was no structure, no instruction about what I should do with my time. So it was up to me. Every day was different. And then when I moved into the ashram, I also started working in the office. So then I sort of had this home base to go to throughout the day. I was a message runner for the woman who had sort of taken me under her wing. And so I would just be precocious, maybe go to the office, then go run an errand, and then meander around, talk to some other kids, maybe go to one of the properties outside the back gate, play in the garden, try to plant things, goof around with some other people, skip around and then end back in the ashram. And then it just sort of veered from there. I started going out more and more further away from the ashram to the point that I started going down to the shopping center, MG Road. I'm 10 years old, getting the rickshaws, buying stuff, finding places in the black market to buy Kit Kat bars. I was very investigative in my pursuits. And, to the point that I started to know a lot of the shop owners. Oh, Kit Kat bar today, Kit Kat bar. And, but then I'd always come back to the ashram and have my home base and live there. But the daily life was not structured. I just happened to be well behaved for the most part. I mean, it does get a little more destructive later when I discovered alcohol, at age 10.
Oh my gosh. So my son is 5. Of course, in another 5 years, he'll be a completely different person. But I still can't imagine him just gone. And you don't know where. And I mean, I know that times have changed a lot, but that just seems like, and as you've said, you were, quite well behaved in the grand scheme of things. So I imagine there were some children there that were different in that sense. And I also think I read that there were 4-year-olds wandering around the ashram, just doing the same thing as you, just meandering about.
Pretty much. It felt like there was this sort of almost like a huge cognitive dissonance or miscommunication. It's sort of like the commune saying the kids belong to the commune. The parents fall for that. And meanwhile, the commune's not taking themselves seriously enough. And they're thinking, oh, the parents are still watching. I mean, I'm maybe that's my imagination, but that's my wishes, I guess, because the thought of 4-year-olds walking around with no guidance is so heartbreaking to me that I can't almost believe it. So maybe this is a justification I made up in my head. But yeah, some of them, I mean, maybe at certain times of the day, they'd meet up with their parents, like at the end of the day, but the whole day they were wandering. And I mean, a lot of the bigger kids would sort of look out for them, but sometimes you see them alone. They just looked lost. And, some walking around barefoot in the ashram, just sort of, meandering around. Yeah.
Then there's a time where you were asked to write a letter of endorsement, basically, on behalf of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, almost like a marketing campaign, for the ashram to say, look how well the children do here.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't know it at the time, of course, but us kids really thought we were special. Like, firstly, if kids weren't allowed and we were allowed, so we must have gotten through the rite of passage to be welcomed. And many people did love us, but they weren't our caretakers. It was just like these passing things. And so I was asked to write this letter or passage to put in the book flap of one of Rajneesh's books. And it was, the title of the book was The Further Shore, and I had no idea what that meant. Like, it was a little too abstract for me. And so I asked somebody what it meant, and my education was already very far behind, let's say. And so I was horrified. But they wanted me to write about how beautiful the experience was, essentially, and how we were special. And then they wanted to show the purity of a child's voice in this unconditioned environment, and sort of how it was a spiritual experience for me. But for me, it was just random words I was trying to put together. Like, it was this conundrum, like, what am I going to write? It was like this panic came over me. And because I knew it needed to be a positive endorsement, because that was the general theme. That was it. That was how we all saw the experience. There wasn't, at that point, I already couldn't think of that there's something wrong with the situation. This was my community. Right. This is my home. I need to promote this idea that Rajneesh is this enlightened being, and he's taking us to the further shore, which essentially is enlightenment or freedom of suffering.
People I've spoken with about their experiences of going to the ashram, of being a part of Rajneesh Puram, people talked about how the malas changed over time. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, I'm guessing your mum maybe had like one of the earlier iterations of the mala, or the original version of it.
Actually, I think she had the second version. So the first version, the very old sannyasins, and there's two interesting things here. So those were like oval. They were more oval. The later ones were round. So the really old ones were oval. Those were people mainly, I think, that took sannyas in the Bombay days before even Pune. And the interesting thing, too, is all of us had prefixes, or most of us had prefixes with our names. Like mine was Ma, Prem, Sarito. And there were several different prefixes which were common, like Anand, Prem, Deva were probably the three most prevalent. But there was one that was yoga. And so it was interesting, like the yoga prefix to your name sort of denoted that you were an old sannyasin, which sort of put you a bit on a pedestal. He stopped using that later. It's just these subtle things that sort of made this sort of hierarchy. So first there was that oval mala and more of the use of the prefix yoga. And then there was the round locket that was wood framed. And they also had a child mala, which is what I had. It was a miniature version of it, the locket. And then I think it was probably once it moved to America, they became just like a plastic mala encased in plastic with no wood. The beads were still wood, but not the locket itself. So those are the three that I know of. I don't know if there's been some since then that have changed again. I don't know.
And I have also heard people describe their closeness to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh in different ways as well, depending on what time they joined the cult. So at what point did you and your mum experience Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh? Was this when he was very active in meeting with people, or this was when he was quite withdrawn, point where people wouldn't see him in person very often?
I think we arrived right in the prime, like the peak. So he was giving evening darshans in his house, this auditorium off his house, where you could go and meet with him individually and ask questions, or that's where he gave initiation himself. And then in the morning, he would give a lecture. So he was very much involved at that point. It was only towards the last 6 months, which I guess was more like 1981. We got there in 78. That the last 6 months he went into silence. And that's what persisted in America until the last 6 months in America when he spoke again, right before the demise of Rajneesh Puram. Yeah, so it was later in like Rajneesh Puram, or maybe towards the end of India, that he had certain special group leaders that started doing the initiation on his behalf. And so that was very strange to me, because I'd like, he's the master, not this other person. Yeah.
What's your experience like of meeting him for the first time and going through the initiation? Because that's the picture on the front cover of your book, right?
That is the picture of me taking initiation. I mean, I have to say I was sort of timid. I was already a very shy child. And for me, it wasn't so much that I thought of him as a spiritual being. I just knew he was important and he was who everyone else was worshiping. And so I felt anxious because, of course, I wanted him to approve of me. Like, I didn't want to mess something up. I didn't want to present myself poorly. So it was more like that anxiety about, oh, I hope he likes me. And sitting there just trying to be a little sort of well-behaved. And I took the initiation and, it did as I was supposed to. But it was interesting because I think he was still talking to me when he was explaining the meaning of my name. And I think I just literally bolted and went and sat back in my seat instead of listening to the whole explanation. I was like, okay, I got my name. See ya. So I think I found him intimidating. But I also didn't particularly worship him for the same reasons other people worshipped him.
And some of the things that you've mentioned about the kind of the historical period that you were in terms of the political climate and the social climate, and people really rejecting the values of, I want to say, predominantly like Christianity, and traditional religious teachings around, saving yourself for marriage and then only having one life partner in life and marrying them early. And then, a lot of purity culture around covering up your body and all of those things that we've talked about at length around purity culture on the podcast. All of that was like really throw the baby out with the bathwater, flipped on its head, completely reversed when it came to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, his teachings, and what was happening in this ashram. It could not have been more different than the purity culture that's been talked about at length on this.
The anti-purity culture in its essence. I mean, firstly, yes, sexuality, all of your restraints about sexuality and being in monogamous relationships was very much discouraged. It was almost like something was wrong with you if you're in a monogamous relationship. You're supposed to just follow your urges, your id. It was a very id-centered culture sexually. And, you could hear people screaming in these tantra groups. And it's like group sex happening. And people even acting out their desires of rape. I mean, I've heard these stories in these groups. But as far as what I saw, it was just a lot of very open sexuality. And it was very clear to me that this was supposedly okay, although my gut didn't quite fall for it, because I always sort of had this romantic notion about relationships. And I imagined myself being in a marriage one day, but I actually almost felt this sense of shame that I even had those thoughts, because it was so not normal in this culture. Similarly, Osho, or Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, was very anti-religion. So he would basically condemn almost all religions, especially Christianity, saying how it was just brainwashing the masses and making everyone follow these leaders blindly, and that he was offering a new way, a way for new man, the real key to spirituality, whereas all the religions were just, dogma, is how he put it.
The environment then not being safe, for anybody really, men and women, if the environment isn't safe for people in the ashram, then obviously, very clearly, it's not going to be safe for unsupervised children.
Absolutely.
And this is one of the things that's explored deeply in your book. And I don't know how much detail you want to go into, but I just wondered if you could give us some insight into the open sexual practices that adults were expected to participate in, how that filtered down directly onto the children.
Yeah. So that the culture was such that, there was lots of partner swapping going on, a lot of open sexuality, even if it wasn't downright sex right in front of me in the public parts of the ashram. It's just like these sort of long lingering hugs and maybe long kisses along the central thoroughfare. But that was, you sort of normalize it after a while because you see it over and over again. And And I think I'll talk about the adults for 1 second first, but I think a lot of the adults really thought that was what they were supposed to do. It was part of their liberation. So, in retrospect, I've heard some adults saying, well, they sort of went along with status quo because that's what it required to belong, in a sense, is to be open and loose sexually. But for the children, we're seeing that, first of all, we're being exposed to that, which is already traumatic to some extent. Because you're watching people in the sexual act or taking showers with adults that are making out in the showers or passing someone's room while they're humping, and you can see it. Some of the kids actually made a sport of watching, just sort of going around the ashram, seeing this happen. But again, when you're watching, there's such a fine membrane between that and then being pulled into it. And so for me, at first, I wasn't affected so much by the sex until me and some of my peers were trying to learn to French kiss at 10 years old by one of the guards that were called samurais. And so that already felt like, okay, or for me, it felt like I was heading into dangerous territory because I could see how I could that attachment bond could happen. And then it would be a sexual connection, not just a adult child connection. So I already felt that, and that was happening quite, openly with lots of the children. Were either sitting on the laps of these men or, we were kissing them when it was late at night when they were doing the darshan and the lights were out. And then that led to the next thing, which is when me and my friend were lured in to give one of these men in the commune a hand job. So that was my first real sexual encounter with an adult man. And I literally thought I was going to vomit or something, but I just bolted from the room. And I learned then to have much more protection around me. I could tell there was this open sexuality. There's sort of a vibe, and some men looked at me, and I'm sure others, in a sort of sexualized way, and I could feel it. Even though no more sort of experience resulted because I was much more cautious. But I could still feel the slimy looks.
And I imagine in some cases there are children who were maybe not able to be more cautious, or maybe were not able to discern kind of the safety and the risk. And so maybe...
Yeah. And they were also in a position with other men who are far worse than what I was encountering.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, gosh.
But
no, that's you just summarized what I was trying to say. It's really, I find it really difficult to articulate myself when we're talking about this subject, because it's like, I'm trying to be very wary of using the right language, and I never want to lean ever into victim blaming, and it's hard to... I just always want to make sure I'm saying the right thing, and sometimes I can't get it out, and you just said it perfectly, so thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So each of the children that were there had a different experience, but I'd say a lot of them had sexual encounters. Oddly enough, or to my out of luck, out of grace, I wasn't going to the school. So I was in the ashram, and I had the office, which was a protective place because there's women who cared for me, and I could go back there. And so I wasn't wandering as maybe readily as other children. And I didn't live in the group house where there was probably 30 children living together. I had a little more contact maybe with sort of structure within the commune. They were living outside in this hut. So there was a huge amount of neglect, right? It was a rotation of parents or adults, but sometimes they wouldn't show up. And I mean, I've heard horror stories. But then a lot of the kids, especially the younger kids, 6, 7, 8, were going to school, the commune school, which was off-site, which I didn't go to. I don't know how the structure worked, but many of the younger kids were there, and the main teacher there was a pedophile. And he sexually abused multiple of the young girls who were 6, 7, 8 years old. And again, I think, when you see these pictures, there's sort of closeness that you don't see in normal culture. Like, these girls are all like hanging all over him. And again, I think it was just what was normalized. And I think many of us were starving for attention. And so mean, I don't want to put words in it. I didn't go through that with them, so I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I can imagine that sense of him making you special, which involved sexual abuse, it was the lack that led them to fall for it even more so. And there wasn't parents around watching. And I think some people actually sort of knew that there was something a little fishy going on. But it was, again, I think the culture in their brains overrode, the voice of the culture overrode their own, overrided, I don't know what the word is. Anyway, it superseded their own instincts. So that's just tragic.
To think about how children were almost disregarded by Rajneesh's teachings as well. It's like that it's a ripe environment for child abuse.
It is so right.
Because it can happen in plain sight.
Exactly. He gave permission, in essence, through his teachings. In essence, firstly, we're these open, beautiful beings for children, but then at the same time, it's not an environment for children. And then here we are, the children in this sort of in-between world existing there. And all these adults are being taught to be open with their sexuality, not to repress their fantasies, not to repress their sexual, kind of delusions or dark fantasies. And there's these innocent children walking around alone, going to school where there's probably not enough teachers per, the ratio to students. And then the kids are off wandering alone, like after school. There's so many stories, and many people have not spoken out, but their stories still exist, obviously. And some of them are far worse than mine. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's the truth.
The isolation aspect of it as well, in terms of moving a lot of children to a new country where there's a language barrier, most likely, where the view on female autonomy in some areas of that country are very different to how they are in countries like America. And then also to kind of be a subculture within India, as in part of the Rajneesh movement, and then to be isolated further inside that subculture in this school. It's just like a funnel of isolation that leads so many already vulnerable people into a more vulnerable place. I can't comprehend it. My brain just, probably in a protective way, I can't actually wrap my mind around it.
It's hard. I mean, for me, it's like, it was what I knew, so it just seemed normal until it took me years to unpack that this wasn't normal. And I had so much of a defense about it, probably also because it was so awful that I made it seem normal just to function. But it was, I mean, first you're in a foreign country, so you don't have that bigger culture to blend into. And that was a very patriarchal culture. And then here we are in this commune, which the women are running it, but it's still patriarchal because the guru is a man sort of surrounded by women. Yeah. Right? And so the administrative women, but all the women in his house too, there were really hardly any men that were as close or taking care of him. And then the children are the lost tribe. And the focus of most people is either on the guru or on themselves, not on the children. And they are taught to think that it's for the children's own good. And we didn't know any better. You have to deal with what you're handed, at least to, most of the time. I mean, if I'm sure kids had tantrums and wanted their mom or dad and got it a little bit, but you have very limited resources as a child.
Makes me think of Janja Lalich's description of a self-sealing system where all roads lead to the same answer. All roads lead to children being neglected, abused, harmed. whichever way you come at it from in this particular cult.
Yeah, 100%.
How did your experiences change over time? You're in the ashram, you're working in the office. At some point, there's another big move back over to America. There must have been a lot of hyper arousal at that time, like big announcement, we're moving. What was that whole process like?
Well, so we weren't told he was moving. We didn't know Bhagwan was leaving. Suddenly he was just gone. And suddenly the whole sort of love and light aura of the commune just sort of collapsed, and people were panicked. Where is he? Where is the commune end? Is it over? What do we do now? A lot of people didn't have money. Their visas needed fixing because they had overstayed by years. No resources. So this sort of panic. And I felt the same, more confusion. And I had a big dilemma because I was really bonded to this woman in the office. And then there was my mother, who I had hardly had any contact with. And so everyone was told to go to their respective countries, and wait for word of when the new commune would emerge. And at that point, we didn't know where exactly. We thought America, we probably got that much information. And so we all left. And so there I am again, back in Hawaii again with my mom, who I had barely had contact with. And I was very depressed, I think. I didn't know that it was depression, but I couldn't fathom not being in the commune. And so very soon I got in touch with Sheila and ended up going to the new commune that wasn't a commune yet in Central Oregon. I went there when there was only about 30 people. I was the 32nd person to arrive there. And I arrived there about a month before my mother because I was so eager. I was like, get me there now. And so I traveled there alone. And there I was in cowboy country with my little red dress and my mala, going, oh my God, where am I?
And at that point, it was like uncultivated land. Like I imagine you arrived and it just looked like you were in the middle of the countryside, like with no buildings, no plumbing, no toilets, no food, like nothing.
I mean, well, there was the old ranch settlement in the very heart of the valley. And so there was plumbing and electricity, but it was like there was one big ranch house that the ranch foreman lived in still. And then a small house that was just packed with sannyasins with a kitchen and, people living there, 3 to 4 people to a room. And then there was this other outbuilding that we converted to a bunkhouse that had 14 people in one bathroom. And that's where I was put. And it turned out that everyone in there was male except me. So there's one boy. There was only one other child when I arrived. The woman that was currently in charge, her son was there, but otherwise there was no other children except for the Harveys, the foreman's 2 daughters. And so me and the other boy lived in the bunkhouse with 13 men. And I'm 12 years old.
Does your mom think about this? Is she like, does she know that you're leaving? Is she questioning why you get to go to the new site sooner than she does? That's such an interesting dynamic, that whole thing.
It's pretty bizarre. So my mom basically always just gave me authority for myself. And so, of course, that again, I think I always wanted her to step in on some level, but I was sort of like, whatever you want to do, whatever you want to do is fine. And so when I said I wanted to go to the ranch, she said, fine. And we got the money for me to go. It was almost like the moms that ran the commune had authority over her and over me. And so if they said it and I wanted to do it, then that's fine. It doesn't matter. I don't even know what she wanted. She didn't say. And I still had the impression that she would be happier if I was out of her hair. And they did say once she got the money, she could come. But in the hierarchy of the commune, she was not beloved like I was. So I was the special child, and I was higher on the hierarchy, kind of, because I was in favor of those people who ran the commune, the moms who ran the commune. I was in favor. She was not. So that even compounded the challenge with me and my mom, right? Because then I felt guilty that she wasn't appreciated by these people and that they didn't like her and they liked me. And so I loved my mom despite everything. And I wanted her to be happy and safe and everything to be peaceful. But it was this constant tug in my heart, like, oh no, she's hurting. And I very much felt like I took on her emotions.
When you talk about Sheila, do you mean Marinan Sheila? Because she has been likened to a cult leader in her own right. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah. So yes, I'm speaking of Marinan Sheila. And the person who was sort of like my mother, the stepmother, was like number 2 or number 3 under her. So I was around Sheila and all of those, that whole cohort to get, all the time. And Sheila, she was always very directive and bossy and, confident. But as time evolved, she sort of had her people that she chose to be in her inner circle. So here's another little inner circle within an inner circle. And as time went on, this women who worked for her directly, there's a few men, but mostly women, they started treating her like a guru. She was the figure of authority. And because Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was in silence, she was his representative. And when that happened, which was the whole time in America until the last 6 months, she just sort of climbed that power ladder to the point that she was definitely authoritarian and definitely had, I didn't think of it like that at the time, but she definitely had the characteristics of a guru. And people were to surrender to what her word was, but because she was speaking for Bhagwan, and meanwhile, Bhagwan was in isolation, and I'm sure she added her own twist to things. Some of it definitely came from him, but I'm sure she augmented that with her own directives. And to this day, that a lot of the people who are still devoted to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh or Osho just see her as the culprit for anything bad that ever happened.
Which leads me perfectly into my next question. She was really, I don't know. Some people would say she was used as a scapegoat. And I think even Rajneesh himself may have even...
Oh my God, yeah.
So talk us through that whole saga. How does it go from you moving over into the early stages of Rajneesh Puram being established? What does Rajneesh Puram turn into, and how does it all fall apart? If people have seen the documentary Wild Wild Country, they'll know why everything falls apart. And, for people that don't know much about cults that watch this documentary, they were like, that is a wild story. Like, that is insane.
And that's the tip of the iceberg.
People. Right. Yeah, exactly. Just talk us through that whole thing.
Yeah. So when I first got there in the beginning, it was a small clan, and we were sort of taking care of the land. We're trying to build little infrastructure for ourselves. And I thought it was going to be this small community, kind of like the ashram, maybe. That's what I knew. Yet we did have 64,000 acres. So soon after I got there, people were arriving daily, and next thing you know, all these sort of trailers, these double wide trailers come in, and that to provide housing, and they just popped up overnight. There were suddenly all these houses for us to live in. Then Sheila arrives, then the moms arrive, and the next thing you know, we're trying to run like the whole Osho or Rajneesh Foundation International that sell books and tapes. And meanwhile, the local ranchers around us are watching, going, what in the world is going on? This is a cult. This is crazy. These people are in orange. Get them out of here. And so at the beginning, Sheila was very good at convincing them that we're just this, loving family that wanted to live there and restore the land, and that they bought it for a short time. But when everything was happening so rapidly, they definitely got skeptical, and she got more defiant. And so the first hurdle we came up against was the fact that the land was agricultural land. It wasn't to be a place where you could run businesses. And Sheila really thought that the laws didn't apply to her because she was in service of a enlightened being. So we were immune to any kind of enforcement from anybody. That's how it seemed to me. And so when government officials and citizens started questioning what we were doing, she was trying to find a way around it. And at that point, we had quickly amassed a group of lawyers who were trying to figure out how to deal with all these challenges that were coming our way. And one of the lawyers came up with the idea that we could incorporate our own city. Because if we were our own city, then we could run our businesses, and then we could also rule ourselves. In essence, we could have our own kingdom, and we wouldn't be, under the sort of rule of the bigger, society. To some extent, there'll still be some rules. So we managed to incorporate the city. We started building rapidly. Then there was all the people who were against us found ways to stop us. So then we'd have to stop building for a while. Then we start building for a while. And in the meantime, while all this back and forth legally is going on, like these building spurts where we work 16 hours a day to get as much done as we could until the next legal, directive came down that you must stop. Sheila had the next good idea, or I don't know who had it, but Sheila instigated it or implemented it, was to buy property in Antelope and run our businesses from Antelope because it was an incorporated town. And then the people in Antelope revolted and said, okay, we're going to disincorporate the town so you can't run your businesses here. So then Sheila's like, oh, no, that's not going to work. Let's buy as much property as we can. We're going to just move a bunch of people from Rajneeshpuram, the new city that's semi-incorporated. It's incorporated, but it's under challenge. We'll move them to Antelope so they can outvote the current residents. Okay. So they go there and outvote them so that the incorporation remains so that we can run our businesses. And so this battle is going on the whole time for 4 years or 3.5 years. And while this is all happening, like more and more people were coming to the ranch, and, first it's 500, then it's 1,000. By the end, I think it was 4,000 residents there. And then a lot of visitors too, because we devised all these different, as we added buildings, we added new services. We created the whole infrastructure. We had our busing system. We built a spiritual university where people could come do therapy groups or like stay for 3 months and do therapy groups a little bit and work for free, pay to work. And and then a lot of people just wanted to be near the master, so they were just dying to come. So it's very easy to get labor. And the reward was these festivals or where Bhagwan would come out and just sit with us in silence while there was music being played. Silence, music, dancing, but he wasn't speaking. And the other highlight of the day was watching him drive by in one of his Rolls Royces. Like that was our break. We had a lunch break. And then after lunch, he would go for his daily drive. So we'd line the road and he would pass. And that just became more of the festivities because that's the only time we got to see him. And so, that's why people were there. So that was the highlight of the day.
There's so much other stuff. This is already like a complicated and layered thing that's happening. There's also the criminal activity at some point starts.
Yeah.
Or I mean, it's always been there.
I think it was always there. It just got to be much more pronounced and much more extreme. I mean, I think it was always this fixing the books. I even heard stories of India where there was all these tax fraud charges, and I've been told that's maybe why Osho actually needed to leave, or Bhagwan needed to leave the country, or we need to close the ashram. There's all sorts of tax evasion going on. So I think there's always these covert things that sort of like this sense that the community was immune to law, it was immune to law, and but it just got worse and worse over time. Yeah, more extreme over time.
I suppose it just I don't know what not overconfident, but just or complacent, but just not trying to hide it anymore because the movement had grown so big and Rajneesh had so much influence. Even if that was being harnessed by not him directly. But what is also interesting is the allegations of sexual abuse against Rajneesh himself, who surrounded himself with women and claimed that he needed to, the female energy in order to remain enlightened, or so I heard. And so there were actually women being abused directly by him in his inner circle.
Yes.
For going back decades before Rajneesh Puram.
Yes. So so interestingly enough, I always wondered, like, is he having sex with people? And for me, I always had this sort of notion that a holy man has to be pure and not sexual. And so the fact that he talked about sex so much, I always felt kind of ick. And I didn't know, I mean, I suspected that something was going on. And it was interesting to me always watching that, especially in India, where I could, smaller, you could see more what was going on versus a huge ranch, that it was always these women were in his house that were so beautiful, like maidens, like they looked like supermodels, but very, I don't know, they looked like pre-Raphaelite paintings is how I sort of saw them. But it only came out after me and some of the other then children spoke out about her abuse. It was only then that a couple of women came forth and told their stories about the abuse at Osho's own hand. And it was shocking. But I wasn't surprised. And of course, it was again under the guise that it was for their own spiritual growth. But it wasn't necessarily consensual. It was very much in service to him from the descriptions I've read. And very much being used, it seemed, that these women were being used. And, he would direct them to have sex with each other in front of him and just stuff that was pretty hard to hear, really hard to hear, actually. And I have to say, I think there's probably far more women that were abused, but I don't believe that many of them think it was abused. I think many of them still think it was a blessing to be that close to the master, because that was so prevalent of an aspiration, that the closer you are to the master, the more special you are. And then the more special you are, the closer you are to liberation and enlightenment, which is the ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm. It's like sounding as though there was criminal activity of all kinds from the beginning right the way through to the end, and it was through every layer of the hierarchy, from the very, very top all the way down to the very bottom. And there were instances of homeless people being busted at some point, and then all of the stuff that happened with the attacks on the citizens of Antelope. So I'm just going to let you continue on with this kind of like madness that just prevails.
Well, it was like every couple of months, or maybe every 5 months, it was sort of like everything started to feel a little calmer, and then some big other bombshell would go off, and I'd be like, oh God, what's going to happen now? And so first it was all the people coming, and I was overwhelmed by that because I really wanted more of an insular kind of family feeling. And then all the building, and then all the controversy with the neighbors and the government. And at one point we had about, I think it was 60 lawsuits against us for various things. I don't know the details. There's also Bhagwan's immigration battle going on, because he came to America with a medical visa, and that had expired. He was trying to get a new visa as a spiritual leader, and the INS said, well, he can't have a visa as a spiritual leader because he's in silence. And then all these sannyasins wrote like 2,000 letters to the INS saying, his silence is so beautiful. It's much more profound than if he was speaking. And so all these people, trying to back him up. So it's sort of like there was the whole group of sannyasins was this whole like almost like army defending our cause. Right.
Hmm.
And so if Sheila asked someone to do something, the answer was always yes. We were told how to vote, I'm sure. Like, okay, we want to incorporate a city. Okay, yes, of course, we have enough people to do that. But then it seems like as time went on, Sheila was trying to find ways to individuate so that we could have autonomy. And her next thought then was, okay, we have a city, but maybe we need to take over the county, right? And I didn't know this till later. Next thing you know, I guess all this stuff was going on. I could see that all the secret stuff was going on, but I did not know what it was about. Next thing you know, I'm in the center of the ranch yard, the sort of hub, and there's these inner city people, very poorly dressed in civilian clothes, not orange or red like we wore, walking around. And they kept arriving, busload after busload after busload. I soon learned it was part of a new program called Share a Home, in which sannyasins were sent to the inner cities of the big cities of America to recruit homeless people to come join the commune for rehabilitation. So they get there, and it was all very confusing because I never thought of us as being a charity because we always seem very self-centered. So why are we trying to help humanity at this point? It did not make sense to me. And these people were rough. I mean, some of them were very sweet, but it was total shock to our normal kind of, free-flowing love, mellow, eye-gazing culture, right? So soon I learned that these people were brought in to vote. There kept being these announcements in the cafeteria. Don't remember to vote, remember to vote. And I never heard anything about voting prior to that. So I was suspicious. I didn't know what was going on. Then voting day comes in Wasco County. All these people are bussed there to vote. And at that point, the county clerk said, no, we're not going to allow same-day registrations and voting. So Sheila just blew up. You are not treating these people humanely. You're treating them like animals. You're taking away their human rights. They all come back to the ranch. Anyway, they're the purpose that we had them there for, we didn't need them anymore. So Sheila just basically stopped taking care of them, had them all dropped off at the nearest city, not even where they were from originally. No money, nothing. No ticket back to where they came from. So next thing you know, all these surrounding cities, the Dalles, Madras, all these towns are like, you're leaving these homeless people in our town with no resources. So they were complaining. And that was the end of that experiment. But it was the way it ended with them was so heartbreaking because they were left with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And they were told that they were being offered all these very helpful tools, medical care, free food, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And, bringing in that amount of new people comes with a risk again of, I don't want to say the term stranger danger, but that type of element of you don't really know who's coming in on these buses. The vulnerability exploitation of the people being bussed in to begin with, and then obviously the children that are in that environment are at further risk. It's just so, as you said, compounded. And there were allegations as well of the people being bussed in being given
Haldol
drugs.
Yeah. Yes. So one thing I will say is that they were sort of kept isolated. So I don't think those people that came in perpetrated the children.
Right.
So that's one good thing, in the grander scheme of things. But it was definitely rough. And I think for us, it was sort of like this culture shock, like, oh, we get to see what's going on in the real world through their like rap singing and stuff like that, which we hadn't been exposed to. But, oh gosh, what was your question? Sorry. Just
the Haldol stuff.
Yes, sorry. Yes. So, yeah, I didn't know about it until one day I was at a meeting with all the homeless people with Sheila and Vidya and a few other people of the moms, and they wouldn't let me drink the beer. And in the past, they didn't really enforce that for us teenagers. And I only learned later that they were basically spiking the beer with Haldol to keep the homeless people under control, to keep them calm. And it's actually a fact that they found in their investigations, that the FBI found in their investigations.
This really was like the beginning of the end of everything, would you say?
I actually, now thinking back, like, I think that's when maybe something internally started feeling like, oh my God, this is scary. This is not home. This doesn't feel like my home. But I don't think I let myself consciously think that until later when there was even more evidence of things going awry. But definitely, I mean, it just felt like an invasion. Like, it just was such a culture clash. These are the inner city people. It's not just it's like people who have been living a rough life, who may not, they're hardened by living on the streets. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
and also, sorry, you go.
Oh, no, it's fine. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and also this is your community of acceptance and peace and love and serenity, and all of a sudden there's all this turbulence that really contradicts what the movement is supposed to be all about. So I remember when I was speaking to Nicola Ranson about her experiences of being a sannyas, and she really couldn't believe what was happening when she was like given a gun and told to go and like man the or go to a point and be on guard. She said it was just such a conflict of everything that she'd lived and breathed over the last few years, and then all of a sudden it was like now we're like violent. I don't know. Like now we're destructive.
Yeah, it's sort of like this meter. First it's like more focused on spirituality, then it sort of keeps moving in the direction of not being about spirituality, just being about politics and defending ourselves as we become militaristic, as we start, instigating these crimes. And at that point, there was sort of very little spiritual activity going on. All of us who worked, we didn't meditate, we didn't do groups, we didn't do anything like that. The only sort of so-called spiritual activity, well, there's two. We were told our work was our spiritual activity. It was our worship, but it really was just hard work for 12 to 16 hours a day. But it was out of devotion. That was how we could show our devotion. But there was no more really self-reflection going on. It was all outward to prove that we could stand up against the government and we could be independent. And it was all because of our devotion to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. And the only real reinforcement we got, well, it was reinforcement to say we're working for this master. But the other reinforcement was just getting the drive-by, which was 2 seconds of seeing him in his Rolls Royce with the window shut. That was enough to keep people devoted, it seemed.
You mentioned that you were 16 years old not when you escaped the cult, but when the cult really just fell apart, disbanded. And that is one of the ways that some people leave a cult. Some people escape, some people are shunned and forced out, and sometimes the cult just implodes. And although Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh or Osho still has some type of legacy, even in mainstream culture, where people will quote him in pop culture references and films and TV. And oh my gosh, it's maddening.
Yeah, no kidding.
I don't know how the screenwriters maybe have some sort of association with the Rajneesh movement, or just don't do enough research on this supposed enlightened being that they're referencing in their books and films. Anyway, that's my soapbox for another day.
Yeah, I'm on the same soapbox. It's sort of like it's like this blind thing. They just see these pretty words and they don't care about anything else. So
Exactly. And I was watching a Disney film the other day and there was an Osho quote and I was like, how?
Are you kidding me?
How? Oh my gosh. So what happens to you when this all, because 16 is a very precarious age. You're still in development. You're still finding your place in the world. And then all of a sudden, are you just in the world, a person in typical society, like having never really been a part of mainstream society? I can't even there's a lot, isn't there?
There's so much. As you could tell, the story is very long and complicated. And believe it or not, I cut out like 60,000 words. So I'm glad I saved you from that. So yeah, 16, I thought I was independent and an adult. Meanwhile, all the women who are my role models, Sheila, the woman who is like my mother, all those moms left in the middle of the night. And so that was sort of my safety net. They were gone. So I was already like totally disoriented and traumatized. Then like a couple months later, the whole commune collapsed. And most of the people I was close to were already gone. They had left a little bit earlier, probably because they had a clue that things were collapsing. I didn't. So there I am, 16, haven't really spoken to my mom for 4 years, only minimally. And I was like, I don't need my mom. I can make it in the world. And I left the ranch. I went to California, and with $300 that my mom did give me. And I thought, I'm going to get a job. I'm very capable. I was always taught I was very, I felt like an adult. I was treated like an adult. The truth was I was not an adult. And it took being thrust into the real world for me to realize that. And it was very quickly clear to me that I didn't have the survival skills really that I needed. I didn't have an education. I was, struggling to read and write because I'd never gone to school. I didn't know how to read societal cues, how to have small talk, something we didn't do much of the ranch. We didn't do small talk. Everything was very direct and blunt. And my money was dwindling away very quickly. And I was in full-fledged panic mode, trying to find a job. And meanwhile, my peers, my good friends from way back, like from India, the women I was closest to now, well, they were girls. We were all the same age, had turned to sex work and stripping. And I knew that I couldn't do it. Like my whole being revolted. But that was what a lot of people were doing to survive. And then I sort of had an epiphany. Firstly, it was that the men who had abused me that I was still attached to, who I had sort of hoped I would be reunited with. And then I saw them in California, 2 of them at least. And I suddenly had this epiphany that they didn't care about me whatsoever. And that was when things really changed for me. I was like, okay, I've got to get out of here because this is dangerous for me. I'll probably end up in sex work like my peers. And later, a lot of them turned to drugs too. So it was this whole scene there for several years. I got out of it. And it was more of like intuition or grace. And I went to Boston and met up with my mom. And it wasn't ideal, but I had a roof over my head. I had food to eat. And I traveled around with her and her husband for about 6 months. And then I came back to Boston on my own. And that time I managed to get temp work and I started integrating into society. So I'd say within about 6 months, I was supporting myself. I was living in a group house with other sannyasins, so the rent was cheap, but I was surviving. But those first few months, I was scared I wouldn't be able to survive. And then as time went on, I met my grandparents again. And because I lived in Boston, that's where my mother grew up. And somehow my grandfather convinced me to try to get an education. And to this day, I am so thankful to him because he brought me back into the fold of mainstream society. Otherwise, who knows? I mean, I don't know what would have happened, but I took my high school equivalency test, enrolled in a junior college for a year, then transferred to a 4-year university. And by sheer determination and some aptitude, I made it through and graduated with honors.
It's incredible. I love these parts of the interview. It's when you're reading somebody's memoir, you're like, I don't know if they're going to be okay, and then they're okay because you've got an interview booked with them, and you know that they've released a book and they're doing the press tour and stuff. But in the moment of reading the memoir, you're like, I'm not sure, and then you get to the part where there's the rebuilding of a life and there's your autonomy and there's your voice and you are telling your own story in your own words, and it's so empowering and it's so inspiring. And I just love these little moments where people mention the advocates that they had when when the advocates were severely lacking, like your grandfather, for example, like a little hero.
At the time. I'm like, you're bugging me. I don't want to be brainwashed by proper education. I was still in the dogma of the commune. It took so much work to find my own voice amidst all these sayings that just floated around in my head, that you take on because that's where you grew up. I mean, we all adapt to our cultures. Yeah. So thanks God for my grandfather. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's such a good example of how, with just a little bit of support from others, but really with your own like grit and determination, recovering from cultic abuse is possible. As you said, it's taken you such a long time to unpack and understand everything that happened. And I know that experiences of abuse are likely situations that people will work on for a lifetime to understand and never really fully recover from. But the healing and the recovery is possible. You've been on this mad journey of like putting your own life together really on your own.
Yeah, very much. I mean, it's a sense my early childhood gave me those skills to survive on my own. But it's not to say that it's not lonely. It's not been always alone, but very much my own work is on my own. And I have to say, so I got my sort of practical life together pretty quickly, between going to university and then getting a good job and fitting in. But only then when I had that security, then all the trauma emotionally kind of surfaced. So then I had to go down that road for many, many years. I mean, I still do therapy because it keeps me sane. And there's always more to work on. I hope there comes a day when there isn't, but I doubt it. I mean, it's actually, I'm happy to continue that journey, but I'm far more stable. But then I was like, okay, I got it all figured out. I have a good job. I own a house. And then this, tsunami of trauma emerges. And that's sort of brought to the fore, with the continuing relationship with my mom, but also trying to have intimate relationships, and that being a minefield to my past and all the sexual exploitation and all the lack of trust and all the abandonment issues come up like a storm. And so then that was the next stage, was working away at that and finding my true voice that way, not just sort of settling into a life that's sort of comfortable, but perhaps a little complacent about what's really going on for me personally. And so that's been a long time in coming. And I think the book is sort of the culmination of that, saying, hey, this is me. This is me integrating that past person that I was with the woman I am today. And I don't need to hide anymore between my professional life and my internal life that I kind of have had shame about. The sort of coming forth as one person, as not being a chameleon to fit all these different people's agendas anymore.
It's such an incredible book. I was I always say this. I was struggling to get through the parts of the sexual exploitation. Those parts are tough.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I did go into a lot of detail, didn't I? Yeah.
I mean, of course, the great thing about a memoir is you tell your story the way you want it to be told. And it's so powerful. And by the end of it, it's like, it's hard to explain. It's really inspiring, but it's educational as well. So for people like myself who haven't had a cultic experience, it really reinforces the things that I've learned through the interviews that I've done, but it's in written form. And the talking about the recovery stuff and the ongoing difficulties with the relationship with your mum, all of it is so important. And I would love listeners to go and grab a copy of In the Shadow of Enlightenment, A Girl's Journey Through the Rajneesh Osho Cult. And I would like to hear what other people think. I'll put links in the episode description to where people can grab a copy. It's a longer memoir, but it doesn't feel long, if that makes sense. Once you start reading it, I thought, gosh, this is going to take me a while, but it really didn't. So I'm just really thankful that I had a chance to read the book, that you wrote the book, and that this subject of the harm of children in the Rajneesh movement is being addressed and highlighted.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for reading it. I really appreciate it.
So what is next then, Sarito? You're like, are you on your book tour? Are you busy like doing talks and everything? Are you going to write another book maybe?
I don't think I'm quite ready to write another book, but I'm not totally writing that off, because I did cut out a lot of material. There was a lot more to say about my recovery. And I did cut that out because I wanted this book to be specifically about the actual cult itself and how that played out. But then I think there's a lot more about my own process of recovery, like the 30 years that aren't in the book, essentially. But for now, I'm out promoting the book, and I mean, it's all a little overwhelming, I have to say, because I'm a private person. So suddenly I put myself in this whole very public, with the book just being so personal. And I don't know. I feel like I'm in the transition. I don't know what's next, but I'm feeling inspired, and I just have to figure out what I want to do next. And I'm still keeping my business, and I'm still working, doing my normal job. So it's a lot at the moment.
It's exciting. I'll be interested to find out when you know which direction you're going in, which way that goes. And until then, we can work together on this big hashtag campaign of #stop quoting Osho. That's what I would like everybody to start using in their social media posts.
Now we're going to call it Stop Quoting Osho. Okay, I will start. Yeah.
Just we just I don't know how those moments where he is quoted, it still reinforces his work or endorses his work, but also, like, I don't know, gets people to go out and buy his stuff, and then there's like a legacy there where money is being made, and
it's massive. I've only touched the tip of the iceberg with that, but if you just go look, I just saw that on Instagram they have millions of followers. And I'm just going, whoa. And it's all these, they put up these quotes of him speaking, these little videos, and there are all these quotes, and there's no acknowledgement from Ocean International Foundation that there was harm to the children. Several news outlets have contacted them, and their response is always the same. Like, this organization had nothing to do, we just sell the books. It had nothing to do with what happened in these other communities. And plus, these perpetrators that you mentioned aren't part of the community anymore. So they're very legally protected. And yet it feels to be, it really rubs me the wrong way, because to me, it's the very opposite of spirituality. It's the very opposite of spirituality. And it's so, and I'm sure they're making money. He has 250 books. Osho has 250 books in different languages. And with that many followers and ads, and I don't know. I mean, I don't have any proof of it, but it seems like, if anything, the movement is growing in leaps and bounds. Yeah.
He was an abuser himself, so I don't know. Even if people say, all these perpetrators that you're like, literally the whole basis of him as an individual and his movement was based on abuse.
It really was.
So I don't know how.
They basically, the people. This is how I see what I've seen, is that the people who are still devout, they have two ways of bypassing his abuse. One is that the people who he abused were not children, so they were of age, and it was their choice. They could have said no, so therefore it wasn't abuse. And people literally, the woman who spoke out first, she was just raked over the coals by sannyasins. Oh. Like, you're just making this up. You're just wanting attention. You're a princess. This kind of thing. And the other thing is, whatever contact, you were lucky to be that close to the master. And if you feel abused, that is because you weren't open to the experience, or it was your karma. It's an opportunity to work through your karma. It goes on, and that's, it's the epitome of gaslighting and spiritual bypass and whitewashing, all of it. Yeah.
That is
And
horrendous.
for the children like me that were abused, they have less license, even though they still use that stuff. They can't use it to the same extent because we were underage, and the law is a lot clearer when it comes to us.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, there's clearly still a lot of work that needs to be done on getting the wider public to acknowledge and understand all of this stuff. And your book is going to contribute to that leaps and bounds. Every single person that speaks out about their experiences are likely experiencing re-traumatization, are likely going to be attacked online or even in person by people that want to defend this man, this mortal being, this non-infallible individual.
Yeah.
And that's probably enough to deter people from wanting to speak out about their experiences, and rightly so. So you have put yourself in such a vulnerable place, and you've put this whole memoir together and given readers the opportunity to really understand what happened in this environment, but also to help us identify the red flags of when it's happening again somewhere else, because it is happening. And there are loads of ashrams where there is reported abuse, the isolation that people experience when they go on these spiritual retreats. It's still happening, and it's still there. And the more people read memoirs like yours, the more we'll be able to protect ourselves against these abusive environments. So it's
absolutely,
it's incredibly poignant.
I sure hope it helps some people to think twice before they take their kid to a ashram or a commune.
And that's really all the questions on my list today. There's loads of other stuff that I wanted to ask you about today, but I've kept you nearly an hour longer than I planned to, so I'll shelf those questions for another time. I just wanted to ask if there was anything you wanted to say before we end the call today.
I think the main thing is just I really appreciate people taking the time to educate themselves about the children in cults, because just like Wild Wild Country sort of omitted us, I think that the story of the abuse of children in cults is often omitted until too late. You know, it's sort of like it's not a red flag prior to getting involved in some type of guru disciple environment. And then once you're in, people tend to give their power over to the guru, and I think their children then fall into that neglect category, and then they might not know as closely what's happening, and then the indoctrination is already happening. So, you know, there's so much more I could say about that, but I think it's a blind spot right there, a sort of exploration, and then people taking their kids along on their own journeys.
Before I started this podcast, it didn't even occur to me that some people don't get recruited into cults. Some people are born and raised in them without that choice, or without going through that coercive experience, or however it is that a person finds themselves in a cult. And I remember going through that process of realizing, oh, hang on a minute, there's like second, third, fourth generation children born into these groups, and there's a whole invisible demographic. So that's another thing that your book is going to be highlighting for people that pick it up and have a read. So In the Shadow of Enlightenment by Sarito Carroll. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Let's keep in touch and keep us posted about what you plan to do next.
I will. Thank you for having me. It was great talking with you.
Thanks so much, Sarito.